Today, we're about to explore the most dumb deaths ever recorded. From a Karen making a huge fire in the kitchen after ignoring instructions to a Karen ignoring police and driving with her car in a dangerous situation no one dared to enter. It was November 2016, and a cold front had settled over Gary, Indiana, bringing temperatures down to the mid-30s with intermittent sleet that made surfaces treacherous. The industrial landscape was dotted with active rail lines that carried freight trains through the heart of the Rust Belt city. At a particular crossing, red warning lights flashed rhythmically as the automated gate arm lowered to block vehicular traffic. Corinne Wild, a 49-year-old warehouse supervisor known for her aggressive temperament and confrontational attitude toward delays, had been stuck behind the lowered gate for several minutes. Her impatient nature and history of verbal altercations with authority figures made her a difficult presence in most professional settings. The crossing's warning system had activated properly, with bells clanging and lights flashing to indicate an approaching freight train. The locomotive's horn sounded repeatedly as it approached the intersection, following standard safety protocols for urban crossings. Corinne exited her vehicle and approached the emergency communication box mounted near the gate mechanism. She began shouting into the intercom, demanding that operators raise the gate immediately and accusing them of deliberately wasting her time. A passenger in her vehicle urged her to return to the car and wait for the train to pass, but Corinne's frustration had escalated beyond reason. She kicked the gate arm repeatedly, causing it to shake on its mounting bracket. The warning lights continued their urgent flashing pattern, while the train's horn grew progressively louder. Despite the obvious danger signals and her passengers' continued pleas, Corinne stepped around the gate barrier and onto the gravel ballast that supported the railroad tracks. The uneven surface consisted of loose stones of varying sizes, creating an unstable walking platform that became even more treacherous in the sleet-dampened conditions. As Corinne attempted to step over the near rail, her foot caught on the irregular ballast stones. She stumbled forward, losing her balance on the slippery gravel surface. Her leg landed directly across the steel rail, just as the locomotive rounded the final curve before the crossing. The freight train, traveling within posted speed limits through the urban crossing, struck Corinne's lower body with devastating force. Her lower body sustained severe traumatic injuries upon impact. The force of the collision threw her torso clear of the tracks, but the damage had already been done. Death occurred within minutes due to massive internal bleeding and traumatic shock. The train's engineer initiated emergency braking immediately upon seeing her on the tracks, but the train required nearly a quarter mile to come to a complete stop. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the engineer's radio call to dispatch. Railroad investigators documented the scene thoroughly, noting the position of Corinne's vehicle, the functioning warning systems, and witness statements from her passenger. The locomotive's event recorder confirmed that all safety protocols had been followed, including proper horn signals and adherence to posted speed limits. Security cameras mounted at the intersection captured the entire sequence of events, showing Corinne's deliberate circumvention of the safety barriers and her subsequent fall onto the active tracks. The footage clearly demonstrated that the warning systems had been operating correctly. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, noting that the victim had trespassed on active railroad property despite functioning safety equipment and clear warning signals. The investigation concluded that Corinne's death resulted from her decision to ignore multiple safety warnings and enter a restricted area during active train operations. It was May 9th, 2015, inside a small neighborhood hair salon in Phoenix, Arizona, where weekend clients filled the chairs and hood dryers hummed beneath warm afternoon light. Lana Wexler was 38 and worked part-time in an administrative office. Known among co-workers for her impatience with delays and disregard for routine instructions when she felt rushed or inconvenienced. That afternoon, she had called ahead, requesting a last-minute appointment before an evening social gathering, anxious to finish quickly and leave on time. After her styling session, the stylist guided her beneath an older industrial hood dryer and instructed her to remain seated while the cooling cycle completed. Lana checked her phone repeatedly, growing restless as minutes passed and the machine continued running behind her. The salon remained busy around her. Another client sat quietly beneath a similar dryer, following standard protocol without issue. Staff moved between stations, trimming, rinsing, and styling as usual. The equipment around the room operated normally, filling the space with steady mechanical noise and circulating warm air. The hood dryer above Lana's chair was an older model, awaiting replacement parts. Investigators would later note that the rear ventilation guard had been removed weeks earlier after damage was discovered, leaving the intake opening partially exposed. Warning labels remained visible on the housing, cautioning users to remain stationary while the unit operated. Against the stylist's instructions, Lana rose abruptly from the chair while the dryer continued running at full speed. Her long hair, only loosely secured, fell free around her shoulders as she stood. As she straightened, several strands brushed against the exposed intake opening and were immediately pulled inward by the rotating fan assembly. The motor continued operating normally, drawing more hair into the internal mechanism. Lana instinctively turned toward the sudden pulling sensation, but the movement only fed additional strands into the compromised intake. Within seconds, tension built rapidly as her hair wrapped tightly around the spinning blades. Feeling the escalating force on her scalp, she attempted to step backward. Instead, the trapped strands drew her head violently upward toward the intake opening as the rotating mechanism continued winding her hair inward. Her face and neck were pulled against the rigid housing of the dryer as the machine maintained constant speed. Her neck hyperextended sharply under the mechanical traction, forcing her head into an unnatural position while the motor continued pulling. Within moments, the sustained force dislocated her upper cervical spine and caused catastrophic injury to the brainstem and spinal cord. When staff finally cut power to the unit, her body collapsed to the floor beneath the dryer, completely unresponsive, while her hair remained tightly trapped inside the intake mechanism. Emergency services were called immediately. Responders arrived within minutes and found Lana unresponsive with obvious signs of severe head and neck trauma. No resuscitation attempts were successful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death as a high cervical spine dislocation with fatal brainstem and spinal cord injury caused by mechanical traction from the entangled hair. The injury was consistent with sudden hyperextension under sustained pulling force. Investigators found the dryer had been operating normally, but the missing rear ventilation guard left the intake opening unprotected. The final report concluded that the death resulted from deferred maintenance and improper use, noting that either repairing the guard or remaining seated would have prevented the fatal entanglement entirely. It was March 12, 2016. The morning air in Coventry, England, was damp and gray. Diane Marie Harlow, a 44-year-old office administrator, sat in traffic on her way to run weekend errands when she turned into a drive-thru for coffee. Diane wasn't known for patience. Her employment file contained multiple HR warnings about her treatment of junior staff, and local retailers had quietly circulated her name after repeated confrontations over minor service issues. She'd been temporarily banned from 2 shops in the previous year for verbally abusing teenage employees over pricing errors. Drive-through service windows operate in confined spaces where vehicles queue mere feet apart, relying on customers remaining inside their cars while transactions occur through small openings. The windows themselves are typically automated, designed with safety sensors that prevent closure if obstructions are detected. Maintenance protocols require these sensors to be tested regularly, but during repair work, facilities sometimes disable them temporarily to service the mechanical components. A contractor's service ticket showed the anti-pinch sensor had been isolated at 7:45 a.m., for a part swap in violation of standard lockout procedure, and no tag was recorded when the shift changed. That Saturday morning, Diane arrived at the fast food chain's drive-thru at 9:47 a.m. After sitting through 20 minutes of construction delays, she ordered a specialty coffee drink, already visibly agitated according to CCTV timestamps. When her order arrived with regular milk instead of the soy alternative she'd requested, witnesses in adjacent vehicles heard her shouting through her open window. The teenage worker apologized and offered to remake it, but Diane threw her car into park and stepped out into the narrow lane. The configuration of this particular drive-thru placed vehicles within 18 inches of the service window when properly aligned. Diane walked forward and leaned her upper body through the window opening, which extended below counter height in the older building design, allowing her to reach through and gesture aggressively at the visibly frightened worker. She was screaming about corporate complaints and demanding the manager when an unmarked delivery van in the lane behind nudged the second car forward as the driver mistook a shift supervisor's wave for green. Her torso became trapped between the two cars, with the second vehicle's bumper contacting the door at an angle that forced the frame inward toward the service window opening. The pressure forced her neck against the metal frame of the service window at an unnatural angle. At that exact moment, a worker inside pressed the automated window control, unaware that the heavy exterior window panel had been placed in manual override during the earlier repair, and that the safety sensor was disabled. The reinforced motorized service window panel, installed during a prior security retrofit, began descending. The reinforced frame compressed against Diane's throat with force exceeding the unit's normal safety threshold. Investigators later confirmed the torque limiter had been bypassed during the unfinished repair override. Her cervical spine hyperextended backward while the window edge crushed her windpipe completely. The teenage worker inside hit the emergency stop, which stalled the motor but could not reopen the panel instantly, leaving several inches of window closed on Diane. When the elderly driver finally noticed the commotion and reversed, Diane collapsed onto the pavement, her neck bent at an impossible angle. Emergency services arrived within 8 minutes, but paramedics confirmed death at the scene. The coroner ruled death as traumatic asphyxiation with cervical fracture caused by mechanical compression, noting she likely lost consciousness within 30 seconds and died within 2 minutes. The surveillance footage became evidence in multiple investigations but was never publicly released. The franchise settled with Diane's family for an undisclosed amount and permanently closed that location 3 months later. It was May 3rd, 2019, when early evening light filtered through the windows of a small restaurant in a coastal village south of Naples. The dining room held 8 tables with checkered cloth, and the smell of garlic and tomato drifted from a narrow kitchen. Devin Pritchard was 47 years old and worked as a civil litigation attorney in Denver. She had traveled to Italy with her sister for a 10-day tour and was described as confrontational, often relying on legal threats when challenged. The family-owned restaurant specialized in fresh seafood. Devin had a documented severe shellfish allergy and carried a prescribed epinephrine auto-injector. After being seated, Devin questioned the server about cross-contamination risks. The server explained the kitchen was small, with shared equipment, and could not guarantee safety. Devin ordered a shrimp pasta without shrimp and refused alternative dishes. When told safety could not be assured, she demanded the owner and threatened complaints under European disability regulations. After further consultation, the server returned and said the dish would be prepared only if Devin signed a written acknowledgement confirming she had been warned and was ordering against recommendation. Devin signed without reading carefully. The dish arrived about 20 minutes later. Devin ate roughly half. She soon mentioned that her throat felt strange, but dismissed concern, attributing it to wine. Within minutes, her voice became strained, and she repeatedly touched her neck. Redness spread across her face and neck. She stood and said she needed air. When asked about her epinephrine injector, She said it was in her purse. By the time her sister retrieved it outside, Devon was leaning against the exterior wall, breathing rapidly with audible wheezing and visible facial swelling. Her sister administered the auto-injector. Devon's condition worsened. She collapsed onto the cobblestone street as the restaurant owner called emergency services. Bystanders kept her on her side while monitoring breathing. Emergency responders arrived approximately 14 minutes later. They found Devon unresponsive with severe airway swelling and initiated advanced airway management before transporting her under resuscitation to a hospital roughly 30 minutes away. Despite aggressive treatment, including epinephrine, antihistamines, and mechanical ventilation, Devon suffered cardiac arrest from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Resuscitation continued for over 40 minutes without success. She was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours after ingestion. Post-mortem examination determined that death resulted from anaphylactic shock due to shellfish protein exposure, with respiratory failure leading to cardiac arrest. Laboratory analysis confirmed trace shrimp protein consistent with cross-contamination. Italian authorities determined the restaurant followed appropriate protocols by providing warnings and obtaining written acknowledgement. No charges were filed.
It was October 8, 2017, in Sedona, Arizona. Desert heat beat down on the Red Rock landscape. A popular canyon trail was experiencing high foot traffic due to the holiday weekend. Lauren Whitmore, 44, was a corporate trainer from Chicago visiting Sedona with her husband for their anniversary. She had hiked portions of trails in Colorado on previous vacations and made a point of correcting other hikers she encountered about proper trail etiquette and gear choices. That morning, she had told other hikers at the trailhead that this route was overrated and too crowded for what it offered. She had little patience for casual hikers who treated trails like amusement parks rather than serious outdoor activities. Lauren had been complaining about the crowds since they started, making comments about people moving too slowly and blocking the trail for photos. She had tried to push past several groups on narrow sections and made remarks about tourists ruining everything. Her husband tried to calm her down multiple times, but she dismissed him. At a crowded section where the trail narrowed near a scenic viewpoint, Lauren stopped in frustration. Her husband suggested they wait a few minutes for the group ahead to clear. Lauren refused, stating she had not driven all this way to stand in line. She pointed to what appeared to be a parallel path approximately 20 feet to the right, a dried creek bed with flat sand that seemed to bypass the congestion. Her husband said it looked unsafe and they should stay on the marked trail. Lauren dismissed him, saying the trail designers had not accounted for this many people. Lauren stepped off the main trail onto the unmarked route without waiting. The dried creek bed appeared solid, with a light-colored sandy surface that looked firm. She walked approximately 60 feet along it, moving faster than the main trail crowd. Her husband called out repeatedly, but she waved him off without turning around. Her right foot suddenly sank several inches into the sand. She stopped and tried to pull it out, but her left foot also began sinking. The surface sand was dry and appeared solid, but beneath it was saturated sand and silt from recent rainfall. Lauren's weight had broken through the thin crust. She tried to lift her right leg, but the suction pulled her deeper. She leaned forward to brace with her hands, but this shifted more weight onto her lower body. Within 90 seconds, she was trapped to her knees and leaning forward at an awkward angle as the saturated sand tightened around her legs. Her husband reached the creek bed edge and attempted to pull her out by her arms, but each attempt caused the surrounding sand to collapse tighter around her legs. Other hikers called emergency services and searched for branches for leverage. Lauren was breathing heavily in the extreme heat, visibly exhausted. She was trapped to her upper thighs, bent forward in a position that compressed her diaphragm. Approximately 6 minutes after getting stuck, Lauren stopped responding. Her head drooped forward, and she lost consciousness, collapsing further into the sand. Hikers attempted to lift her upper body, but the suction made it nearly impossible. Specialized rescue personnel reached the creek bed nearly 40 minutes after the first emergency call. By then, the surrounding sand had hardened around Lauren's legs, requiring controlled digging and water to loosen the packed silt before she could be freed. When rescuers finally pulled her from the ground, she showed no signs of consciousness. Investigators later concluded that prolonged entrapment in extreme heat, combined with the forward compressed position of her body, led to a rapid medical collapse before rescue teams could stabilize her. Her death was attributed to heat-related stress and positional asphyxia after leaving the marked trail and entering unstable terrain.
It was May 29th, 2013. The afternoon heat in Scottsdale, Arizona, shimmered off Spanish tile rooftops as Donna Kruger stood in her backyard, squinting at the cloudless sky. At 45, she had spent the last 3 months waging what neighbors described as an increasingly erratic campaign against delivery drones, convinced they were violating her property rights and spying on her daily routines. Donna had inherited her grandfather's 12-gauge shotgun after his death the previous winter, but possessed no formal firearms training beyond loading shells. A former insurance adjuster who had been laid off 2 years earlier, she spent her days monitoring online forums about property rights and airspace laws, becoming convinced that commercial drones represented a personal invasion. Her social media posts showed an escalating obsession with defending her territory, often photographing aircraft overhead and researching legal precedents about airspace ownership. Modern delivery drones operate at altitudes between 200 to 400 feet, well within federal airspace regulations, and in 2013 were primarily limited to small test programs and survey flights rather than widespread consumer delivery. Donna had filed multiple complaints with local authorities about drone activity over her neighborhood, claiming the aircraft were conducting surveillance and violating her privacy rights. That Tuesday morning, Donna had received another dismissive response from the authorities regarding her complaints about unauthorized drone flights. Neighbors reported hearing her shouting about taking matters into her own hands while pacing in her backyard. Around 2 in the afternoon, a test survey drone, operating as part of a limited pilot program, approached her neighborhood, following its programmed route to a nearby address. Donna grabbed her grandfather's shotgun and climbed onto her single-story home's Spanish tile roof, despite having no experience with either firearms or roof navigation. The tiles, heated to over 140 degrees by the desert sun, made footing treacherous as she positioned herself near the roof's edge. Witnesses from neighboring properties watched as Donna raised the heavy shotgun toward the approaching drone, which was flying approximately 250 feet overhead. She had loaded the weapon with standard birdshot, completely inadequate for the distance and target. When she fired, the unexpected recoil caused her to lose footing on the superheated tiles. She tumbled backward, sliding down the steeply pitched roof before falling approximately 20 feet into her landscaped garden below. Her body struck a decorative boulder arrangement, causing massive blunt force trauma to her head and torso. The shotgun fell separately and discharged upon impact due to inertia, causing the firing pin to strike, sending the second round harmlessly into the air. The combination of steep slope, heat, and heavy recoil made the slide unavoidable. A neighbor immediately called 911 after witnessing the fall. Paramedics arrived under 10 minutes, finding Donna conscious but bleeding heavily from multiple head wounds. Despite their efforts to stabilize her condition, she succumbed to severe brain trauma and internal bleeding during transport to the hospital. The medical examiner determined that Donna died from massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with contributing factors including heat stress, dehydration, and blood loss. She had remained conscious for approximately 6 minutes after the fall, before losing consciousness permanently. Her estate was settled quietly, with the property sold after extensive cleanup and removal of the blood-stained landscaping where she had fallen. It was September 2015, and the dense canopy of a West Virginia state forest filtered the late morning sunlight into scattered patches on the forest floor. The air carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp soil, typical of the region's humid autumn climate. A well-maintained trail wound through towering oak and maple trees, marked with occasional wooden signs warning hikers about various forest hazards. Delilah Frey, a 52-year-old online reseller who specialized in natural products, had joined a small hiking group exploring the area's diverse ecosystem. Her dismissive attitude toward authority and argumentative nature had already created tension with the volunteer trail guide. Delilah prided herself on her self-taught knowledge of wilderness survival, gleaned primarily from internet forums and amateur foraging websites. The group had stopped near a rotting log approximately 3 miles from the trailhead when Delilah spotted a cluster of white-capped mushrooms growing in the rich soil. The volunteer guide immediately cautioned against touching any wild fungi, pointing to posted warnings about toxic species common to the area. Delilah scoffed at the advice, accusing the guide of unnecessary fear-mongering and claiming that mainstream experts deliberately suppressed traditional foraging knowledge. Despite multiple warnings from both the guide and other hikers, Delilah picked one of the larger specimens and examined it closely. She insisted her online research had taught her to identify edible varieties, dismissing the guide's formal training in mycology and years of field experience. The mushroom appeared pristine, with a clean white cap and sturdy stem that matched descriptions from various foraging websites she considered authoritative. Despite the warnings, Delilah broke off a large portion of the mushroom and ate it raw, insisting that a small sample posed no risk, chewing it thoroughly while maintaining eye contact with the concerned guide. She refused suggestions to seek immediate medical attention, claiming that her body could handle any mild digestive upset. The group reluctantly continued their hike, with several members expressing discomfort. The initial hours passed without incident as the group completed their planned route and returned to the parking area. Delilah showed no immediate symptoms and appeared vindicated. However, approximately 8 to 12 hours after ingestion, severe gastrointestinal distress began late that evening. Violent vomiting and diarrhea forced her to pull over multiple times during her drive home. The symptoms intensified throughout the night, but Delilah experienced a temporary improvement the following morning that gave her false hope. This brief respite masked the progressive liver damage occurring internally. By the second day, her condition deteriorated rapidly as organ failure accelerated. Family members found Delilah disoriented and jaundiced in her home and immediately transported her to a small rural emergency department. By the second day, she became increasingly confused as hepatic encephalopathy set in, followed by seizures as her liver function collapsed. The small rural facility lacked specialized equipment for advanced toxicology treatment. Despite emergency efforts to stabilize her condition, Delilah suffered cardiac arrest within 48 to 72 hours of consuming the mushroom. Resuscitation attempts failed, and she was pronounced dead at the clinic. The rapid progression from apparent recovery to complete organ failure followed the classic pattern of severe mushroom poisoning. Subsequent toxicological analysis confirmed the presence of amatoxins, deadly compounds found in several wild mushroom species native to West Virginia forests. Investigators documented witness statements from the hiking group, including the volunteer guide's warnings and Delilah's deliberate consumption despite posted safety notices. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental poisoning, emphasizing that the victim had ignored multiple warnings from qualified personnel. It was October 14th, 2018, when a quiet evening in a modest home in southern Indiana ended in a fatal kitchen accident. Outside, autumn temperatures had begun to drop, but inside the single-story house, dinner preparations were underway beneath warm overhead lighting. The kitchen contained aging appliances that had been in regular use for years, including an older model stovetop pressure cooker stored beneath the counter. Marla Kinsey was 44 and worked in local delivery services, spending long days driving neighborhood routes and meeting strict deadlines. According to co-workers and family members, she was known for an assertive personality and a strong belief that experience outweighed written instructions. Investigators later noted that she had a documented history of dismissing manufacturer safety guidelines and treating warning labels as unnecessary precautions. That evening, she prepared to use the pressure cooker to finish a meal. Her husband had earlier noticed hardened food residue accumulating around the appliance's pressure release valve and suggested that it be cleaned before the next use. Records later showed that the instruction manual, which outlined regular valve maintenance and lid locking procedures, had never been opened since the appliance was purchased 2 years earlier. According to investigators, Marla refused assistance and attempted to secure the lid herself after it failed to seat normally against the rim. Instead of stopping to inspect the obstruction, she applied additional force until the locking mechanism engaged. Multiple warning labels on the cooker indicated that improper sealing and blocked venting systems could cause dangerous pressure buildup, but those warnings were ignored. She then activated the burner and increased the heat to maximum. Within minutes, internal temperature began climbing rapidly inside the sealed chamber. Later, examination showed that hardened residue had obstructed both the primary and secondary pressure release systems, preventing normal venting. With no functional escape path, pressure rose far beyond the cooker's design limits. The aluminum vessel expanded as internal force increased. Stress fractures formed around the lid locking assembly, which had already been weakened by improper seating. As the cooker continued heating, the locking ring began to deform under the mounting load. Investigators determined that Marla had leaned directly over the cooker, attempting to inspect the lid as pressure continued to rise. Moments later, the locking mechanism failed completely. The lid separated from the vessel and launched upward with explosive force, propelled by compressed steam and boiling contents. The metal lid struck her face and skull at close range, delivering massive blunt force trauma. She collapsed beside the stovetop as superheated steam vented violently into the kitchen. Family members immediately contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived to find extensive head injuries incompatible with survival. Marla was pronounced dead at the scene. A subsequent investigation found no mechanical defect in the appliance itself. The coroner ruled the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force head trauma resulting from a pressure cooker lid becoming a high-velocity projectile. Inspectors documented multiple safety violations, including a clogged vent system, forced closure of the lid, and operation at excessive heat levels despite clear warning labels. The final report concluded that the accident was entirely preventable. Proper cleaning of the pressure release valve, adherence to manufacturer instructions, and use of standard operating procedures would have prevented pressure from reaching lethal levels. The incident was classified as a fatal user error explosion caused by willful disregard of basic appliance safety protocols. It was November 18th, 2017. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the narrow streets of Exarchia, Athens, where Elaine Edelstein stood on her third-floor balcony, glaring at the feral cats gathering in the alley below. Within hours, her obsession with eliminating these animals would lead to her own death. Elaine was a 52-year-old retired middle school teacher from Connecticut who had moved to Greece 3 years earlier, drawn by cheap rent and Mediterranean fantasies. Her neighbors knew her as perpetually irritated, filing noise complaints and posting angry signs about trash disposal. She spent her days scrubbing her apartment with bleach and documenting perceived violations of building codes. Her only regular social contact was with Maria, a local shopkeeper who tolerated her complaints about the neighborhood's stray cat population, which Elaine blamed for everything from mysterious odors to scratched cars. The alley cats were a fixture of Athens street life, fed by residents and generally ignored, but Maria said Elaine saw them as disease vectors ruining her adopted home. She'd filed complaints with local authorities for months, receiving no response. Her frustration mounted as the colony grew, cats breeding and gathering near the dumpsters behind her building. Her online footprint showed that she began researching solutions, eventually ordering a fast-acting agricultural pesticide powder marketed for rapid knockdown and labeled as highly toxic on contact and ingestion. That Saturday morning, Elaine prepared her solution. She opened 3 tins of supermarket tuna and mixed in the powdered chemical, stirring it with a fork from her kitchen. She wore no gloves, her bare hands covered in residual residue as she prepared a dozen contaminated portions. The product online warned of acute toxicity through ingestion and inhalation. Warnings Elaine had apparently skimmed over or dismissed entirely. Around 11 in the morning, Elaine descended to the alley and distributed the poisoned tuna along the wall where cats gathered. Maria, arriving to open her shop, witnessed Elaine wiping her hands on her skirt before heading back upstairs. 20 minutes later, Maria saw Elaine through her open window, eating crackers and cheese, still without having washed her hands. By 2 in the afternoon, Elaine was experiencing rapid onset symptoms consistent with acute poisoning. She began vomiting violently, her vision blurring as the toxin disrupted her nervous system and blood oxygenation, leaving her disoriented and weak. She suffered impaired coordination and severe dizziness. She stumbled toward her apartment door, likely seeking help. The marble stairwell outside her unit was notoriously steep, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. Elaine made it 3 steps before her disoriented, hypoxic brain failed to coordinate her legs. She pitched forward, arms barely rising to break her fall. Her forehead struck the marble step edge. The impact was loud enough that 2 neighbors opened their doors immediately. They found Elaine face down on the landing, blood pooling rapidly from a depressed fracture above her right eye. One neighbor, a retired nurse, checked for pulse while another called emergency services. The ambulance arrived within 12 minutes, but Elaine never regained consciousness. She died en route to the hospital. The autopsy revealed a high concentration of a fast-acting pesticide compound consistent with agricultural neurotoxic agents in her stomach and bloodstream. The skull fracture had caused massive intracranial hemorrhaging, which by itself carried a high risk of death. But the toxin's effects on blood pressure and oxygen delivery dramatically worsened the trauma, making the bleeding catastrophic and unsurvivable. The medical examiner concluded the poisoning had acutely impaired her motor coordination, directly causing the fall. Several of the cats were later found dead or missing, though no complete count was ever officially recorded. Elaine's apartment was cleared by a distant cousin. It was November 23, 2017, and thin morning air surrounded ancient stone terraces in the Peruvian Andes. Clouds drifted through valleys below as sunlight illuminated weathered granite structures. Tour groups moved along designated paths marked with rope barriers. Celeste Havering was 54 years old and worked as a residential real estate developer in Orange County. She had traveled to Peru with her husband on a guided historical tour. Her husband later described her as someone who viewed rules as suggestions and responded aggressively when denied access. The group of 12 tourists was led by a licensed guide with over a decade of experience. Heavy rainfall in the weeks prior had caused erosion and instability in unreinforced areas, prompting site management to expand restricted zones with rope barriers and multilingual warning signs. Before entering the site, the guide explained that certain areas were closed due to weather-related instability and that violating barriers could result in removal and penalties under Peruvian law. Around mid-morning, the group reached a stone terrace overlooking ruins descending toward a river valley. An orange rope barrier blocked access to a narrow platform along the cliff edge, with signs warning the area was unstable. Celeste questioned why photographs were not allowed from the platform. The guide explained erosion had undermined support beneath the terrace, and that engineers determined it could not safely bear weight. Celeste responded that she had paid more than standard tours and expected full access. The guide reiterated that no operator was permitted to enter closed zones and that his license prohibited barrier violations. Celeste raised her voice, accusing him of ruining her vacation, and began recording him on her phone while other tourists watched. While the guide remained with the group, continuing his explanation, Celeste walked briskly toward a different section of barrier, approximately 40 feet away, where the rope was anchored to a fixed post. She glanced back toward the guide, who was facing away while addressing other tourists, and stepped over the rope. Her husband called out, but she waved him off and walked onto the stone surface. She moved toward the outer edge of the platform and raised her phone to take a selfie, positioning herself near a visible crack where the stone met the underlying soil. According to multiple witnesses, the surface appeared intact underfoot, but as Celeste shifted her weight forward, the compromised substrate failed without warning. The stone slab fractured along a weakened seam, and a section measuring approximately 6 feet across separated from the main platform. Celeste dropped vertically for roughly 25 feet before striking a lower stone wall shoulder first. The impact caused her body to rotate, after which she tumbled an additional 30 feet down the terrace slope, striking multiple stone edges before coming to rest on a lower landing. The guide radioed emergency services as nearby tourists shouted for help. Rescue personnel reached the location within 25 minutes, using climbing equipment and restricted service paths to access the site. Celeste showed no signs of life when rescuers arrived and was pronounced dead at the scene. Examination later determined that death resulted from severe traumatic brain injury, including skull and cervical spine fractures, along with multiple fractures and internal organ damage consistent with a fall onto stone surfaces. Site management provided maintenance records documenting the area's closure, and witness statements from 11 tourists confirmed the guide's warnings and Celeste's deliberate barrier violation. Authorities classified the death as accidental with contributory negligence, and the barrier system was later reinforced with additional signage and physical supports.
It was January 19, 2014, in Atlanta, Georgia. Gray clouds hung low over the city as temperatures dropped. A 14-story office building in the downtown business district housed multiple companies and saw heavy weekday traffic. Lorraine Vickers was 46 years old and worked on the 12th floor as an office manager. She had been with the company for 8 years and was familiar with the building's layout. She was known for frequently complaining to building management about various inconveniences, including the temperature controls, parking assignments, and what she considered unnecessary fire drills. She had previously sent multiple emails demanding the company provide special accommodations for her during evacuations due to her knee problems, insisting she shouldn't be expected to use stairs like everyone else. She often reminded co-workers that she had seniority and certain standards she expected the building to meet. On this day, she was preparing to leave when the fire alarm sounded. Lorraine's co-workers immediately moved toward the stairwell, but she stopped and rolled her eyes. As others filed past, she loudly commented that the alarm was probably another drill and that she refused to walk down 12 flights of stairs for nothing. A co-worker urged her to come along, but Lorraine waved her off dismissively and walked toward the elevator bank instead. Lorraine pressed the elevator call button repeatedly. Another co-worker passing by told her the elevators were disabled and urged her to use the stairs. Lorraine snapped that she knew what she was doing and continued pressing the button. After approximately 2 minutes, one elevator began ascending. A sensor malfunction in the recall system had prevented this particular unit from fully shutting down. The elevator stopped at the 12th floor and the doors opened. Lorraine stepped inside with her belongings and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed and the elevator began descending. Smoke from the 9th floor fire spread through the corridor and began seeping into the elevator shaft through gaps around the doors and ventilation openings. The elevator descended past the 11th floor normally. Between the 10th and 9th floors, smoke density increased significantly in the shaft. As conditions in the shaft worsened, the elevator's safety system triggered an emergency stop, leaving the car halted between floors near the 9th level, where the fire was burning. The doors did not open. Lorraine was trapped inside. Smoke began entering the cabin through door seams and the ceiling ventilation panel at an increasing rate. The emergency call button connected her to building security. Her voice was recorded asking for help and stating she could not breathe. The call lasted approximately 90 seconds before she stopped responding. Fire crews arrived within 5 minutes of the alarm. They accessed the elevator shaft from the 9th floor and forced open the doors within 14 minutes of Lorraine entering. She was found unconscious on the floor, surrounded by dense smoke. Lorraine was removed and brought to ground level. Paramedics administered oxygen and attempted resuscitation, but she did not regain consciousness. She was transported to a medical facility and pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after arrival. The cause of death was smoke inhalation leading to asphyxiation, with critically elevated carbon monoxide levels in her bloodstream. The 9th floor fire had been contained quickly, but smoke had spread rapidly through the elevator shaft. Investigators determined Lorraine had entered an elevator that should have been locked out due to a sensor malfunction. Her decision to use the elevator during an active fire alarm was cited as the primary contributing factor. The building management replaced the entire elevator recall system and installed additional visual warning systems at elevator banks during fire alarms.
It was September 18th, 2014. The afternoon sun baked the desert asphalt along Interstate 10 near Mesa, Arizona, casting heat ripples that distorted the lines of traffic moving steadily at 75 miles per hour. Dust devils stirred along the shoulder, lifting small stones and loose paper into brief spirals. Eleanor Brickman, a 67-year-old retired bookkeeper, sat in her unregistered sedan at a gas station tucked between the frontage road and the interstate. Her hand-painted wooden license plate leaned slightly to the left on the bumper, the rough brushstrokes clearly visible to anyone paying attention. For the past 3 years, Eleanor had immersed herself in sovereign citizen ideology, drawn in by online forums she had discovered after her husband's death. Friends and relatives described her as increasingly distrustful of any government authority, convinced that some laws were merely suggestions imposed on the uninformed. Neighbors recalled her repeatedly confronting postal workers over routine deliveries, filming city employees performing inspections, and openly refusing to comply with parking regulations or permit requirements. Eleanor kept a notebook filled with scribbled arguments about voluntary contracts and constitutional loopholes, which she often referred to aloud when explaining her actions to anyone nearby. That afternoon, Eleanor had clashed with a road maintenance worker assigned to shoulder cleanup. He had insisted she could not park her vehicle with a wooden license plate, prompting a heated exchange in which Eleanor loudly declared all vehicle registration to be voluntary contracts she had never signed. The worker threatened to call the police and recalled Eleanor's face flushed. She retreated to her trunk and carefully retrieved a hand-painted stop sign. She announced aloud that she would stage a constitutional demonstration against traffic enforcement, likely convinced that her actions would assert her legal independence. Eleanor walked along an unfenced frontage access point leading to an interstate overpass, then descended to the shoulder of the busy highway through a maintenance gap in the barrier fencing. Multiple witnesses later estimated she stood on the concrete barrier separating the shoulder from the right lane for approximately 30 to 60 seconds, holding her homemade sign and shouting about constitutional rights. At least one motorist later reported calling 911 to report a pedestrian near the lanes, but traffic continued flowing at highway speeds, drivers unaware of the developing situation. Eleanor's behavior escalated as she stepped closer to the active lanes, apparently believing her protest would force vehicles to acknowledge her authority. Eleanor walked directly into the right travel lane of Interstate 10. A traffic monitoring camera mounted near the overpass captured her stepping into the path of oncoming vehicles, her stop sign raised above her head. A commercial semi-truck traveling at highway speed, later estimated between 70 and 75 miles per hour, had no time to react. The driver later reported seeing Eleanor appear suddenly in his lane, but couldn't stop in time. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Eleanor's body was thrown forward dozens of feet away, landing in the median strip. The truck driver immediately pulled over and called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, with troopers assuming control of the scene, but Eleanor showed no signs of life. The coroner's report detailed massive blunt force trauma, including complete chest compression, severe head injury, and catastrophic internal bleeding. The injuries were deemed unsurvivable, with death occurring within seconds of impact given the forces involved. Traffic backed up for miles as investigators documented the scene, and traffic cameras provided clear evidence of Eleanor's deliberate actions. The truck driver, a 15-year veteran of long-haul driving, left the profession permanently after the incident. It was July 2017, and the late afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over a community pool in Mesa, Arizona. The concrete deck radiated heat waves that shimmered in the 110-degree temperature, while the chlorinated water provided the only relief from the desert's oppressive climate. Pool staff had begun their closing procedures, placing orange cones around equipment and posting temporary closure signs near the diving area. Lula Jet, a 54-year-old event coordinator known for her domineering personality and confrontational approach to authority, had arrived just as lifeguards announced the facility's closing time. Her aggressive nature and sense of entitlement had made her unwelcome at several local venues. The pool's 12-foot diving platform had been marked off-limits for routine cleaning and maintenance. Despite clear verbal announcements and visible closure signs, Lula became increasingly agitated with the staff's refusal to accommodate her demands. She physically moved lane dividers that had been positioned to block access to certain areas, ignoring the lifeguards' explanations about safety protocols. Her behavior escalated as she accused the young employees of deliberately targeting her, her voice carrying across the pool deck as other patrons looked on uncomfortably. The diving platform's surface remained wet from the day's activities and recent cleaning procedures. Warning signs had been posted at the base of the ladder, clearly indicating that the area was temporarily closed to swimmers. Lula dismissed these precautions and began climbing the metal ladder despite repeated warnings from staff members who had gathered below. Once on the platform, Lula positioned herself at the edge and demanded that staff take photographs of her dive. She blocked the ladder with her body, preventing lifeguards from reaching her while she posed for pictures. The wet concrete surface beneath her feet had become increasingly slippery as water from the cleaning process continued to evaporate. As Lula adjusted her stance for another pose, her feet lost traction on the slick platform surface. She slipped sideways mid-stride, her arms flailing as she attempted to regain balance. The fall occurred rapidly, with her body rotating as gravity pulled her toward the pool deck below. Her body rotated sideways, and her neck and upper spine struck the concrete pool edge with catastrophic force, fracturing several vertebrae and violently rotating her body. A fraction of a second later, her skull struck the same concrete edge head first. The impact caused a high cervical spinal cord injury, resulting in immediate loss of consciousness and respiratory arrest. Lula's motionless body entered the pool face down, sinking immediately beneath the surface. The lifeguards, who had been positioned nearby due to the ongoing confrontation, reached her within seconds and pulled her from the water onto the pool deck. Emergency medical personnel arrived within minutes, but their resuscitation efforts proved unsuccessful. The combination of severe spinal trauma and skull fracture had caused immediate and irreversible damage. Lula was pronounced dead at the scene, with the primary cause listed as catastrophic blunt force trauma. Investigators documented the sequence of events through witness statements from multiple staff members and pool patrons who had observed the confrontation. Security cameras captured portions of the incident, including Lula's unauthorized access to the closed diving platform and her subsequent fall. The medical examiner's report confirmed that the vertebral fractures and skull trauma were consistent with a fall from the 12-foot platform onto the concrete pool edge. The facility reopened the following day after a thorough safety inspection. It was November 6, 2017, at a busy rail crossing in Newark, New Jersey, where residential streets met active freight tracks and weekday commuters gathered during the height of the morning rush. 29-year-old Sloan Mercer worked in retail management, supervising staff at a downtown clothing store. Known for her impatience and confrontational approach to obstacles, she was running late for her opening shift that Tuesday morning. She hurried along crowded sidewalks toward the crossing, aware that arriving late meant delaying store operations and explaining herself to supervisors who expected strict punctuality. The crossing arms had already descended across the roadway, red warning lights flashing in synchronized patterns. The familiar sound of train horns echoed through the urban landscape as the approaching locomotive announced its presence to anyone within hearing distance. Safety protocols were functioning exactly as designed, creating multiple layers of warning for pedestrians and vehicles. Other pedestrians gathered at the intersection, accepting the inevitable delay that comes with urban rail transportation. The crossing barriers created a clear physical boundary, supported by posted warning signs and active audio-visual alerts. Standard safety equipment had been recently inspected and certified by transportation authorities. Several witnesses later reported observing her pacing impatiently and muttering angrily while waiting behind the lowered barrier. Sloan observed the scene with growing frustration. Her confrontational nature emerged as she calculated the time being lost to her morning schedule. Rather than wait with the other pedestrians, she made the decision to circumvent the safety barriers and attempt to cross the active rail line before the approaching train reached the intersection. She stepped around the lowered crossing arm and began sprinting across the multiple sets of tracks. The distance appeared manageable, and her pace seemed adequate for clearing the rails before the locomotive arrived. However, halfway across the crossing, her foot caught in the flangeway gap between the rail and the pavement, a narrow groove that guides train wheels through the crossing. The unexpected obstacle caused her to stumble forward, losing her balance and falling directly into the path of the oncoming train. The locomotive struck her midsection with devastating force, the impact causing catastrophic blunt force injuries. The massive weight and momentum of the freight train made survival impossible from the moment of contact. The locomotive operator immediately applied emergency braking procedures, bringing the train to a stop approximately a quarter-mile down the track. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the impact, but Sloan was pronounced dead at the scene. The severity of the injuries left no possibility for medical intervention. Transportation authorities conducted a thorough investigation of the incident. Their official report confirmed that all safety systems had been functioning properly at the time of the collision. The crossing arms, warning lights, and audio signals had activated according to standard protocols. The locomotive operator had followed all required safety procedures, including the sounding of warning horns at appropriate distances from the crossing. Multiple pedestrian witnesses provided consistent accounts confirming the victim had deliberately bypassed the active safety barriers. Security camera footage from nearby businesses corroborated witness statements about the sequence of events. The final report documented that the victim had deliberately bypassed active safety barriers and entered the rail crossing against clearly posted warnings and visible safety equipment. It was May 17, 2014. The narrow streets of Shibuya, Tokyo hummed with midday delivery traffic as Lynn Cameron stepped out of a convenience store, already irritated by the scooters weaving past pedestrians on the crowded sidewalk. Lynn was a 41-year-old English tutor from Manchester who had lived in Tokyo for 8 years, building a modest client base teaching conversational English to business professionals. Friends described her as competent but combative, someone who had learned just enough Japanese to argue with strangers over minor infractions. Colleagues at the language school where she taught part-time mentioned she had been reprimanded twice for confrontations with building security over access procedures. That morning, Lynn had already posted 2 photos to social media showing delivery scooters parked near building entrances, captioned with complaints about obstruction. Drivers for courier services worked under extreme time pressure, making dozens of stops per hour while maneuvering 550-pound scooters loaded with cargo boxes secured by bungee straps and brackets through spaces barely 4 feet wide. Co-workers later recalled her mentioning plans to confront the next driver she saw violating what she believed were parking regulations. The intersection near the convenience store was a known congestion point where delivery drivers regularly paused to check addresses before continuing their routes. No official pedestrian barricades or crossing signals were installed at this exact curb cut. At 12:43 in the afternoon, a courier on a delivery scooter slowed near the curb, checking his navigation screen While balancing the loaded cargo box mounted behind his seat, Lynn emerged from the store, immediately spotting what she perceived as another violation. Witness accounts mentioned her walking directly toward the scooter as the driver prepared to accelerate back into traffic. She stepped off the sidewalk into the narrow street, positioning herself directly in the scooter's path while raising her phone to record. The driver saw Lynn step in front of him and immediately applied his brakes. The scooter's front wheel briefly lost traction under emergency braking, causing the vehicle to swerve slightly right. Lynn continued advancing, phone raised, demanding the driver stop and provide identification. She was less than 3 feet from the front wheel when the driver's emergency braking caused the heavily loaded cargo box to swing outward on its mounting bracket, which investigators later noted had measurable lateral play. The unsecured corner of the box, a sharp aluminum edge, made contact first. The scooter's mirror setup did not cover the immediate close-range blind zone directly in front of the vehicle. The metal corner of the cargo box, carrying approximately 40 pounds of packages, struck Lynn's left hip with enough force to spin her body counterclockwise. Her feet tangled as momentum carried her backward. She fell with her arms still extended, holding her phone forward, unable to break her fall. The impact of her head on the curb was accentuated by a slight slope in the street pavement, and the curb's edge had a chipped section with exposed reinforcement visible in the concrete. The back of her head struck the concrete curb with what witnesses described as a sound like wood splitting. Her phone clattered across the pavement, camera still recording the sky. Lynn's body went immediately rigid, then slack. She never moved again. The driver dismounted and signaled for assistance as bystanders called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Lynn unresponsive with severe head trauma. Hospital imaging confirmed a basilar skull fracture and cerebral edema. She died the next day. Investigators noted the curb lacked pedestrian control barriers. The investigation concluded within a week. Witness accounts detailed that Lynn deliberately stepped into the vehicle's path. Her phone, recovered from the scene, contained 47 seconds of footage showing her approach and the moment of impact before the device fell. The footage was entered into court records but never released publicly. The driver faced no charges and returned to work after providing testimony. It was March 21st, 2018, when afternoon sun blazed over turquoise waters off Koh Samui, Thailand. A tour boat rocked gently near the outer edge of a buoyed reef zone, with coral formations visible beneath the surface as tourists prepared for the afternoon snorkeling session. Jessa Thormond was 38 years old and operated a lifestyle brand producing travel content for thousands of followers. She had arrived in Thailand on a content creation trip, booking excursions specifically for filming. Former collaborators later described her as someone who dismissed safety protocols as obstacles to dramatic footage and treated guides as assistants rather than authorities. The snorkeling excursion carried 13 tourists and 2 staff members, led by a certified instructor. The reef lay within a protected marine zone, marked by floating buoys anchored roughly 80 yards apart, forming a designated swimming area intended to keep guests away from strong currents near the reef's drop-off. Before entry, the instructor conducted a safety briefing, explaining that swimmers were required to remain inside the buoyed area due to intensified currents beyond the boundary. He referenced prior incidents and emphasized he would remain in the water to assist anyone who struggled. Jessa asked to swim outside the marked area to photograph coral near the reef edge. The instructor refused, explaining that currents beyond the boundary had pulled swimmers into deeper water, and that company policy prohibited leaving the zone. Jessa argued that her snorkeling experience made the restriction excessive, holding up her waterproof phone case and saying she needed angles unavailable from the tourist area. The instructor repeated his refusal and warned that leaving the zone would require her return to the boat. The group entered the water around 2:30. The instructor floated near the center of the swimming area as guests adjusted masks and fins. Jessa swam away from the group almost immediately, heading toward the far boundary with strong strokes. She reached the buoy line within minutes. The instructor called out and signaled for her to return. Witnesses later reported that Jessa acknowledged the signal but continued swimming, briefly submerging as she passed beyond the buoy while holding her camera rig. The instructor pursued her as Jessa surfaced intermittently but continued outward, filming beneath the surface. She moved roughly 40 yards beyond the boundary, reaching the point where the reef dropped sharply and the water darkened. According to the instructor's statement, Jessa appeared to recognize the current's pull when she attempted to turn back. Her movements slowed and became less coordinated as she tried to make headway. The instructor reached her with a flotation aid, but she resisted while still holding her camera. Her breathing became rapid and uneven. The instructor grasped her arm and signaled the boat operator. Jessa pulled away, swallowing water and coughing as she shifted from horizontal to vertical, struggling to keep her head above the surface. The instructor secured the flotation device under her arms, but her panic escalated. She thrashed violently, striking him and briefly pulling him underwater. When he resurfaced, Jessa had submerged. He dove immediately, locating her 5 to 6 feet below the surface with her snorkel flooded. The boat reached their position within 90 seconds. Crew members pulled Jessa aboard, finding her unresponsive and not breathing. CPR was initiated immediately as the boat returned toward shore, where an ambulance was waiting. Paramedics worked for more than 30 minutes attempting resuscitation. Jessa was transported to a nearby medical facility and pronounced dead approximately 1 hour after the incident. Findings later determined that death resulted from drowning due to seawater aspiration. Thai maritime authorities interviewed passengers and crew, finding the instructor's actions consistent with rescue protocols. Recovered phone footage showed Jessa swimming beyond the boundary and filming until moments before she struggled. The tourism board later mandated additional buoy signage warning of dangerous currents.
It was March 14th, 2015, in Portland, Oregon. Rain misted the streets as the city came to life. A multi-story renovation project had been underway for 3 weeks in a mixed commercial district. Marla Dennison, 41, owned a boutique 2 buildings down from the construction site and had built the business from scratch over 6 years. She took pride in creating a calm, upscale atmosphere for her customers and viewed the construction as a personal attack on her livelihood. For weeks, she had complained about the noise disrupting her customers. She left aggressive written complaints taped to the fence and had confronted workers during breaks, calling them inconsiderate and unprofessional. That morning, after particularly loud jackhammer noise, she told her assistant she was going to handle it herself, since no one took her seriously. Around 10:20 a.m., Marla closed her store temporarily and walked toward the construction site. She wore business casual clothing and carried her phone. Witnesses later reported she appeared agitated and was looking up at the building as she approached. The entrance gate was partially open where a delivery truck had just exited. A worker near the gate was occupied with paperwork and had his back turned. Marla had no construction experience and no hard hat or safety vest. The site's active work zones included overhead crane operations, and loads were being moved across the upper floors at irregular intervals. Marla walked past the open gate without announcing herself or waiting for clearance. She moved approximately 40 feet into the site, navigating around stacked materials and equipment. Her focus remained upward, toward the source of the noise on the 3rd floor. A crane operator on the 4th floor was repositioning a load of steel I-beams bundled together, weighing roughly 600 pounds. The load was being moved horizontally across the building's exterior before being lowered to the ground-level staging area. The operator had a limited view of the ground directly below due to the angle and building structure. Marla stopped in the center of the staging area, still looking upward. She raised her phone, appearing to record or photograph the work above. A ground crew member approximately 50 feet away noticed her and began moving in her direction, waving his arms. The crane load swung slightly as it cleared the building edge, a normal movement during repositioning. The operator began the descent, following the planned path to the staging area. The load was approximately 30 feet above ground when it entered Marla's vicinity. The ground crew member shouted, but machinery noise masked his voice. Marla remained stationary, looking at the wrong floor. The beams descended at approximately 2 feet per second. At 15 feet above ground, the load entered Marla's peripheral vision. She looked up and stepped backward instead of moving laterally. The beams struck her head and upper body directly. She collapsed immediately under the weight and did not move. Work stopped within seconds. The ground crew reached her within 30 seconds and lifted the beams, but she was unresponsive with severe visible trauma. Emergency services arrived within 7 minutes and pronounced her dead at the scene. The cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with skull fracture and crushing injuries. Investigators reviewed safety protocols, crane logs, and witness statements. Security footage confirmed Marla had entered without authorization into a clearly marked active work zone. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by unauthorized entry. The construction company was in compliance with safety regulations, but implemented additional gate security measures. Marla's family did not pursue legal action.
It was November 22, 2017. The dusty roads of Córdoba province in Argentina stretched endlessly under the Argentine sun, their isolation hiding dangers that would claim a life before sunset. Marie Kowalski, 42, had relocated from Minneapolis 6 months earlier, seeking a fresh start after a series of road rage incidents had cost her employment at a regional insurance firm. Her Minnesota driving record showed multiple citations for aggressive driving and a restraining order from a driver she had pursued home on 2 separate occasions. Her relatives recalled she viewed confrontations behind the wheel as tests of principle, rarely considering the risk of escalation. Her move to Argentina had not changed her fundamental approach to driving conflicts. Local residents and neighbors noted several tense encounters she'd had in the preceding months, with minor horn-honking disputes and gestures that never escalated into physical violence but drew wary stares. Language barriers had prevented full escalation, leaving Marie frustrated and increasingly insistent that others understand her position. On the day of the incident, Marie believed a motorcyclist had cut her off at a rural intersection outside the city. The perceived slight triggered her familiar pattern of pursuit, following the rider for approximately 12 miles through increasingly remote countryside. Her dashboard camera captured her voice, growing more agitated as she narrated her grievances, convinced the motorcyclist needed to be confronted about his dangerous driving. The motorcyclist, unaware of Marie's intentions, said that he simply continued toward his home along the isolated dirt road. When he turned into his property's long driveway, Marie followed without hesitation. Her dash cam recorded her parking behind his motorcycle, effectively blocking his exit route. She immediately exited her vehicle and began walking toward him, shouting in broken Spanish about his driving, mispronouncing words, and mixing English phrases in a way investigators later said likely worsened confusion and made her intent harder to interpret. The homeowner retreated toward his garage, repeatedly gesturing for Marie to leave his property. Marie ignored his warnings, continuing to advance while pointing accusingly and raising her voice. Her fragmented Spanish and failure to respond to his shouted commands appeared to be interpreted as refusal rather than misunderstanding, increasing his visible agitation. The dashboard camera captured her stepping closer despite his obvious distress and defensive posture, though the camera's fixed forward angle limited clear visibility once she moved fully out of frame. As Marie moved to within a few feet, the motorcyclist drew a legally registered handgun possessed under a valid provincial firearms authorization, again ordering her to stop. Investigators later noted that he remained positioned near the garage entrance with limited retreat options. The camera recorded Marie shouting defiantly and taking another step forward just before a single gunshot echoed across the property. She collapsed immediately beside her vehicle. The homeowner placed an emergency call shortly after the shooting, but the nearest hospital was approximately 45 minutes away. Paramedics arrived roughly 53 minutes after the shooting, finding Marie had already succumbed to her injuries. The dashboard camera provided a continuous visual and audio record of the pursuit and confrontation. Though not every movement was fully visible, the autopsy revealed a single gunshot wound to the chest, causing massive internal bleeding and lung collapse. Death occurred within minutes from blood loss and respiratory failure, with injuries determined to be rapidly fatal. Provincial authorities reviewed the dashboard footage, witness statements, and ballistic evidence and conducted a formal prosecutorial review before ruling the shooting justified self-defense under Argentine law weeks later. Marie's body was repatriated to Minnesota, where a small funeral service was held for family members. It was March 2016, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the commercial alley behind a strip mall in Phoenix, Arizona. The desert heat had begun to ease, but the asphalt still radiated warmth from the day's scorching temperatures. Dumpsters lined the narrow passage between buildings, their steel surfaces baking in the remaining sunlight. Maren Gall, a 46-year-old retail supervisor, had developed a reputation among local shop employees for her aggressive scavenging habits. Her territorial nature and confrontational attitude made her unwelcome at most businesses, but she persisted in her belief that anything discarded became public property the moment it hit the dumpster. On this particular day, she had spotted what appeared to be valuable items protruding from a large commercial container. Several shop employees had gathered near the back entrance of their store, taking their afternoon break when Maren arrived. They watched as she dragged a folding step stool from her car, positioning it against the side of the dumpster. Posted warning decals clearly indicated that garbage pickup was scheduled for that evening, but Maren dismissed their concerns with her usual hostility. She accused the workers of harassment when they mentioned the imminent arrival of the waste collection truck. The dumpster's heavy steel lid was propped open on a warped hinge, creating a gap just wide enough for someone to climb through. Maren positioned her step stool and began climbing into the container, her movements deliberate despite the awkward angle. The employees retreated inside, unwilling to engage further with her increasingly aggressive behavior. As Maren shifted her weight against the rim, the dumpster's warped hinge finally gave way. The heavy steel lid dropped under its own weight, swinging downward with brutal momentum. The descending lid struck the back of Maren's head and upper neck, causing a catastrophic occipital skull fracture and cervical spine injury that rendered her unconscious instantly among the broken glass, soaked cardboard, and loose debris that filled the container. Her body lay motionless in the darkness as the sound of approaching hydraulics grew louder. The counterbalanced hinge system that should have prevented such catastrophic failure had failed due to metal fatigue and prior structural damage from repeated use and improper maintenance. The garbage truck rounded the corner into the alley sometime shortly after, its driver following his regular route. The hydraulic arms automatically clamped onto the dumpster's sides and lifted the entire container high overhead. As the mechanism tilted the dumpster forward, Maren's unconscious body slid helplessly into the truck's hopper along with the rest of the waste. The compactor ram activated with its programmed sequence, applying thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure to compress the mixed debris. Her ribs fractured under the immense force, her pelvis collapsed, and internal organs ruptured as the machinery continued its relentless cycle. The driver, unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind him, completed his route and headed toward the transfer station. Hours later, workers at the waste processing facility made the grim discovery during the routine unloading process. Human remains were found among the compressed garbage, prompting an immediate investigation. The medical examiner determined that Maren had suffered severe head trauma from the falling lid before the fatal crushing injuries occurred during compaction. Investigators interviewed the shop employees who had witnessed the initial confrontation and confirmed the sequence of events. Security footage from a nearby loading dock camera captured the lid dropping as Maren leaned into the container, providing crucial evidence for the investigation. The death was officially ruled accidental, resulting from unauthorized entry into a commercial waste container. The case highlighted the dangers of dumpster diving and the unpredictable nature of industrial waste collection equipment in urban environments. It was February 2nd, 2018, when an overcast afternoon settled over a loading dock behind a mid-sized shopping plaza in central Ohio, where slick asphalt and steady drizzle slowed delivery operations. Sophia Dre, a 47-year-old resident coordinator at the neighboring apartment complex, had spent the last 8 years managing various tenant relations and facility access issues across properties in the region. Known among building staff for her domineering attitude and tendency to bypass established procedures when she deemed them inconvenient, Sophia approached situations with the confidence of someone who believed her status as a long-term resident trumped posted regulations. She had received multiple written notices from property management regarding unauthorized access to restricted areas, but had never faced serious consequences. That afternoon, she was attempting to retrieve a designer handbag she had accidentally discarded into the commercial waste compactor before the scheduled evening pickup. The standard retrieval protocol involved contacting maintenance staff who held keys to the compactor's access panel and lockout controls. However, the large industrial compactor sat with its top-loading door propped open, the machine's motor humming in standby mode. The unit had been left accessible during an interrupted maintenance check, with the operator having stepped away temporarily. The control key remained in the panel, as was common practice during active service intervals. Rather than waiting for maintenance to return, Sophia made a calculated decision to retrieve the item herself. She approached the compactor and, ignoring the prominent warning decals about unauthorized access, positioned a nearby plastic milk crate against the unit's side. Using this as a step, she hoisted herself up and over the 4-foot metal rim, lowering herself into the compactor's chamber. The interior space measured approximately 6 feet deep, with vertical steel walls and a flat compression plate currently retracted at the top position. A maintenance worker returning with supplies called out a warning, but Sophia dismissed the concern with an irritated response. As Sophia bent down, searching through the compressed refuse pile, her weight shifted against the interior wall. This triggered the pressure-sensitive safety mechanism, but the system had been temporarily bypassed during the maintenance procedure. The compactor's automated cycle, still armed from its previous operational setting, interpreted the pressure change as a signal to resume the compression sequence. The massive steel plate, weighing over 800 pounds, began its motorized descent from the top of the chamber. The electric motor's steady hum blended with the ambient noise of delivery trucks and ventilation systems throughout the service corridor. Sophia realized the danger as the plate descended, but the smooth vertical walls offered no handholds for escape. The opening remained 4 feet above, now impossible to reach. The compression plate continued its programmed cycle, designed to compact waste into dense blocks. The sustained pressure compressed her body against the accumulated refuse and the chamber floor. The mechanical force continued through its full programmed compression cycle as the automated system completed its sequence. A delivery driver discovered the situation when noticing Sophia's shoes visible at the base of the compactor chamber. Emergency responders arrived within 11 minutes, but Sophia was found unresponsive. The compactor was immediately shut down and the plate reversed, but revival attempts were unsuccessful. The county coroner's examination determined the cause of death as crush asphyxia, resulting from sustained compression of the thoracic cavity. The official incident report documented Sophia's unauthorized entry into the restricted equipment, noting that standard safety protocols required contacting maintenance staff rather than personal retrieval attempts. The compactor showed no mechanical malfunction, operating exactly as designed. Property safety investigators concluded that proper adherence to posted procedures would have prevented the incident entirely. It was July 14th, 2015. The Bruce Highway stretched through Queensland's Sunshine Coast under strong midday sun as peak hour traffic moved steadily northbound. Marissa Diaz, a 38-year-old real estate clerk from Brisbane, merged her compact SUV into the center lane, towing a caravan she'd purchased 3 months earlier. Friends said that Marissa had bought the used caravan immediately after her divorce finalized, eager to start fresh with weekend getaways. She worked for a mid-sized property management firm, processing rental applications and fielding tenant complaints for modest pay. They described her as impulsive and cost-conscious to a fault. The caravan purchase reflected both traits. She'd paid cash to avoid financing fees and declined the dealer's recommended safety inspection to save $200. The previous owner had warned her about rust damage around the hitch assembly, but Marissa dismissed it as cosmetic. She'd towed the caravan only twice before, both times on quiet suburban roads. Caravanning requires understanding weight distribution, hitch capacity, and proper safety chain installation. The chains serve as backup if the primary coupling fails, designed to keep the caravan attached during mechanical failure. Marissa had done neither. A later mechanical inspection would reveal severe pitting and a fractured shear bolt on the coupling. Safety chains had been routed through a non-structural mount and were corroded. That afternoon, Marissa was relocating the caravan to a coastal campground she'd reserved online. Traffic was moderate but moving fast, most vehicles cruising at 60 miles per hour. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, a commercial truck driver attempted to merge ahead of her. Marissa accelerated aggressively, blocking the merge. The truck driver sounded his horn twice. Marissa responded by brake checking once, tapping her pedal hard enough to flash her brake lights. The caravan lurched, but held. The truck driver backed off, but Marissa wasn't finished. 30 seconds later, she brake checked again, harder this time. The caravan swayed violently, fishtailing slightly before stabilizing. Multiple drivers noticed the erratic behavior. Several reached for their dash cams, anticipating trouble. The truck driver maintained distance, but Marissa's anger hadn't subsided. At 1:18 in the afternoon, Marissa slammed her brakes a third time with full force. The corroded hitch assembly, already weakened by metal fatigue and repeated oscillation stress from the earlier brake events, fractured completely. The coupling separated instantly. The safety chains, corroded and attached to non-structural mounts, snapped under the sudden 2,000-pound shock load when the coupling failed. The caravan broke free. The 15-foot caravan veered left, jackknifing across 2 lanes into oncoming southbound traffic. Its nose swung unpredictably as the tongue separated, causing it to yaw violently. A sedan swerved violently right, clipping a motorcycle. The motorcycle rider went down, sliding across asphalt. 2 more cars collided trying to avoid the careening caravan, which finally tipped onto its side, blocking both southbound lanes. Behind Marissa, the commercial truck driver locked his brakes. However, the 18-ton truck could not stop in time due to limited emergency braking distance at 53 miles per hour. The truck struck Marissa's SUV at 53 miles per hour. The rear cabin collapsed inward under high-speed rear intrusion forces, the impact crushing everything from the back seats forward. Marissa's torso and skull were compressed forward as the rear structure intruded and the driver's seatback failed under impact load. She died instantly, her body pinned in the wreckage. Police alongside paramedics arrived minutes later, following an emergency call from one of the motorists. They closed both directions of the Bruce Highway for 6 hours. The coroner recorded massive blunt force injuries to Marissa's head and chest incompatible with life. 11 vehicles were involved in the chain reaction collision. Investigators seized SD cards, matched GPS timestamps, and synchronized 7 separate dashcam clips to reconstruct the sequence. The caravan was impounded and eventually scrapped. It was January 6th, 2020, when late morning sun warmed white sand on a Queensland beach in northern Australia. The temperature approached 95 degrees. Turquoise water stretched toward a barrier reef, visible miles offshore. About 30 beachgoers gathered near a patrolled swimming zone marked by red and yellow flags. Kendrix Valance was 39 years old and worked as a personal fitness trainer in Seattle, operating a small studio. She was vacationing in Australia with her boyfriend, who later described her as supremely confident in her physical abilities and dismissive of safety warnings she viewed as exaggerated. They arrived around 10:30 at a beach monitored by volunteer surf lifesavers. Large signs at the entrance and patrol station warned that marine stingers were present due to seasonal conditions and that swimming was not recommended outside a small netted enclosure. The warnings specifically mentioned box jellyfish and irukandji jellyfish, both potentially fatal. Kendricks read the signs and remarked that the warnings were meant to scare tourists. She said she had swum in tropical waters throughout Southeast Asia without incident, and that jellyfish stings were rarely serious. When her boyfriend suggested using the netted area, Kendricks said it looked crowded and unappealing. They set up towels roughly 200 feet south of the patrol station. As Kendricks walked toward the water outside the flagged zone, a surf lifesaver called out, instructing her to swim inside the designated area due to stinger risk. When she replied that she was an experienced swimmer, the lifesaver explained that box jellyfish had been sighted recently and that multiple stings had been reported over the previous week. He stated that patrol policy required directing swimmers back to shore during dangerous conditions. Kendricks became confrontational, saying she did not need supervision. She pulled out her phone and began recording, accusing the lifesaver of harassment. Other beachgoers paused to watch as the lifesaver calmly reiterated that box jellyfish stings could be fatal and that the netted enclosure was the only cleared area. Kendricks laughed, dismissed the warning, and said she would swim where she chose. The lifesaver radioed for backup and followed at a distance as Kendricks waded in and began swimming parallel to the beach, moving away from the netted zone against a light lateral current. Her boyfriend remained on shore. After several minutes, covering roughly 70 yards, Kendricks' swimming motion changed abruptly. She stopped making forward progress, her body stiffening before she began thrashing at the surface. Cries of distress were audible from shore, and 2 lifesavers entered the water immediately. They reached her within 90 seconds. Kendricks was floating face up, breathing rapidly, with extensive linear welts visible across her torso, arms, and legs, consistent with jellyfish tentacle contact. She was semi-conscious, moaning in pain, and unable to coordinate her movements. The lifesavers supported her and brought her to shore while radioing for vinegar. On the sand, vinegar was applied to inactivate remaining nematocysts. Welts covered roughly 30% of her upper body. Kendricks remained conscious but in severe distress, with rapid breathing and a markedly elevated heart rate. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes and initiated advanced life support. During transport to the nearest tertiary hospital, approximately 45 minutes away, Kendricks developed cardiac arrhythmias consistent with the cardiotoxic effects of box jellyfish venom. Despite antivenom administration and aggressive supportive care, Kendricks suffered complete cardiovascular collapse about 2 hours after the sting. Resuscitation attempts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead. Coronial findings determined that death resulted from cardiac arrest, secondary to severe box jellyfish envenomation. Forensic analysis identified venom consistent with Chironex fleckeri, with sting patterns indicating contact across a large body surface area. Investigators concluded surf lifesavers followed proper protocols and that Kendricks had been repeatedly warned. Queensland authorities made no procedural changes, and the case was later incorporated into lifesaver training materials.
It was November 3, 2015, in Denver, Colorado. Frost clung to the grass as the sun climbed higher. A residential neighborhood of single-family homes had been experiencing intermittent natural gas service issues due to aging infrastructure. Rita Drummond, 52, had lived in her 2-story home for 14 years and worked part-time doing bookkeeping from home. She had a history of disputes with service providers, convinced most were trying to overcharge her or create unnecessary work. Neighbors described her as someone who believed she knew better than the experts and wasn't afraid to say so. That day, she was home alone when a technician arrived around 9:15 a.m. to inspect her gas meter. He identified a faulty pressure regulator and recommended shutting off the gas supply until repairs could be completed later that day. Rita became immediately confrontational, insisting her appliances worked fine and accusing him of creating unnecessary work to charge more money. She threatened to call his supervisor to complain. The technician shut off the main gas valve, tagged it with a warning label, and instructed her not to tamper with it. Rita stood visibly angry, criticizing him throughout. After the technician left, Rita remained outside near the meter, which was located on the exterior wall near her basement entrance. She had basic familiarity with the valve system from previous service calls and believed the technician had dramatically overreacted. Approximately 15 minutes after the technician departed, Rita returned to the gas meter. She removed the warning tag and used a wrench from her garage to reopen the main valve, turning it slowly until it opened fully. Gas began flowing into the basement through the supply line, but without the pilot light ignited, it began accumulating in the enclosed space. The basement had minimal ventilation, one small closed window, and no active exhaust system. The faulty regulator caused gas to flow at a higher rate than normal. Rita spent approximately 12 minutes upstairs before noticing the house felt colder. She went to the basement to check the furnace. As she descended the stairs, the concentration of natural gas in the air had reached a flammable level. The gas, which contained an added odorant, was now detectable, but Rita had already entered the space. Rita reached the furnace and attempted to relight the pilot manually using the built-in ignition button. The electrical spark from the ignition mechanism triggered an immediate explosion. The blast originated at the furnace and expanded rapidly through the basement, fueled by the accumulated gas. The explosion blew out the basement windows and caused the first floor to partially collapse into the basement. Rita was at the epicenter and was thrown against the concrete foundation wall. The force caused severe structural damage to the home and ignited a fire that spread through the debris. A neighbor 2 houses away heard the explosion and called emergency services immediately. First responders arrived within 6 minutes. The house was heavily damaged, with active fire in the basement and first floor areas. Firefighters extinguished the blaze within 35 minutes and entered the basement once it was deemed structurally safe. Rita was found near the furnace area, severely injured and unresponsive. She was extracted and transported to a medical facility but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma and thermal injuries sustained in the explosion. Investigators found the main gas valve had been reopened and the warning tag removed. The technician's service report confirmed Rita had restored gas flow against explicit safety instructions.
It was February 6, 2015. The evening air in Orlando, Florida hung thick with humidity, clinging to the asphalt and the rows of parked cars outside an elementary school. Patricia Mendoza sat in her silver sedan, the engine idling, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. Her face was flushed from rage after the volatile school board meeting that had just ended, where heated arguments and pointed accusations had left the room tense and silent in turns. Patricia had built her reputation as the most feared parent advocate in Orange County's school system. A former marketing executive turned full-time activist, she had dedicated the last 8 years to what she called educational accountability. She had confrontations with school administrators, teachers, and other parents she deemed inadequate. Local education officials knew her well. She had successfully lobbied for traffic pattern changes around 3 schools, always citing child safety while targeting families she personally disliked. Patricia's methods were calculated and ruthless. Her laptop contained detailed files on dozens of parents, noting everything from divorce proceedings to financial troubles. That evening's board meeting had been particularly volatile. She had publicly accused a single mother of neglecting her learning-disabled son, presenting printed screenshots of the woman's social media account posts as evidence of poor parenting. The woman had fled the meeting in tears, while Patricia demanded the school investigate the family's home situation. Security eventually escorted her from the building. Patricia stormed through the school parking lot. She had successfully forced 2 families to transfer their children to different schools through similar campaigns, and this case would be her most public victory. At 7:43 in the evening, well outside active school hours, Patricia pulled out of the school parking lot while simultaneously typing a text message to one of her friends about the incident. Traffic cameras captured her sedan accelerating through the very school zone she had lobbied to expand. Her phone was later confirmed as visible in multiple frames after enhancement of nearby intersection camera footage as she approached the intersection of Colonial Drive and Semoran Boulevard. The light had been red for 8 seconds when her vehicle entered the intersection at approximately 47 miles per hour, never slowing down. Immediately, A delivery truck struck Patricia's sedan on the driver's side with devastating force, crushing the cabin and spinning the vehicle before it came to rest against a traffic signal pole. The truck driver immediately called 911 while several witnesses rushed to the wreckage, but the driver's door was completely compressed, making rescue impossible. Patricia's phone was found on the passenger floor, still displaying the half-finished text message she had been typing when she ran the red light. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes, but Patricia had already succumbed to her injuries. The medical examiner determined she died from massive chest trauma, internal bleeding, and complete spinal cord transection caused by blunt force crushing. Her dash cam footage, which survived the side impact despite partial damage, showed her looking down at her phone for the final 12 seconds before impact, completely oblivious to the red light ahead. The school district implemented new conduct policies for public meetings following Patricia's death. Her 2 teenage children were placed with relatives who later, according to court filings and family statements, revealed the toxic environment Patricia had created at home, where she had trained them to spy on classmates' families for her campaigns. It was January 2018, and a bitter winter morning had settled over Newark, New Jersey, with temperatures hovering near freezing and light snow dusting the sidewalks. Inside a mid-rise apartment building, maintenance crews had arrived early to conduct routine elevator inspections required by city safety codes. The building's aging traction elevator system had been experiencing intermittent mechanical issues, prompting management to schedule comprehensive maintenance. Petra Hinge, a 62-year-old leasing assistant known for her controlling personality and abusive treatment of maintenance staff, had developed a reputation for interfering with building operations. Her territorial nature and sense of authority over common areas had created ongoing conflicts with both residents and service personnel. Despite repeated warnings from building management, Petra consistently ignored posted notices. The maintenance team had positioned orange warning cones around the elevator entrance and posted clear signage indicating that the system was temporarily out of service. The traction elevator had been placed in inspection mode, which disabled normal operation and allowed technicians to manually control its position, using a hold-to-run switch for safety checks. During this process, the car often remained misaligned with floor levels, while technicians adjusted its position incrementally. Petra arrived at the elevator bank and immediately began arguing with the maintenance workers, accusing them of deliberately inconveniencing residents. She shoved the warning cones aside and demanded immediate access to the elevator, claiming that her work responsibilities took priority over routine maintenance. The technicians explained that the car was currently positioned several inches below the floor level and that they were actively adjusting it. Despite multiple warnings from the maintenance crew about the dangerous misalignment, Petra forced open the elevator doors using the emergency release mechanism. The gap between the floor and the elevator car was clearly visible. The elevator car was positioned more than a foot below the landing level, creating a dangerous vertical gap. The technicians shouted additional warnings as she approached the opening. Without hesitation, Petra stepped forward with one leg inside the elevator car and her upper body still outside the doorway. Her foot found empty space where the elevator floor should have been, and she fell forward into the gap. At that precise moment, a technician on a different floor was operating the inspection control panel, pressing the hold to run button to jog the elevator car upward to the next alignment position as part of the standard inspection procedure. Petra became trapped at the waist between the rising elevator car and the building's floor edge. The traction system's motor responded to the technician's control input, applying tremendous upward force against her midsection. Her pelvic bones fractured immediately under the crushing pressure as the car moved upward several inches before the technician released the control button. The immense pressure compressed her internal organs, causing severe internal bleeding and damage to vital structures. Petra lost consciousness within seconds as her body went into traumatic shock. The maintenance crew immediately activated emergency stop procedures and attempted to reverse the car's position, but the damage had already occurred during the brief mechanical movement. Emergency medical personnel arrived within minutes, but the severity of Petra's injuries made successful treatment impossible. The crushing trauma to her pelvis and abdomen had caused irreversible damage to multiple organ systems. She was pronounced dead at the scene, despite resuscitation attempts. Building inspectors conducted a thorough investigation, examining the elevator's mechanical systems and maintenance logs. The inspection revealed that all safety protocols had been properly followed by the maintenance crew, that appropriate warnings had been posted, and that the technician had been performing standard inspection procedures when the unauthorized entry occurred. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by crushing injuries sustained during unauthorized entry into an elevator shaft during active maintenance operations. It was March 18, 2016, at a suburban shopping center in central Ohio, where weekend shoppers moved between floors beneath glass ceilings. Zelda Quigg, 41, worked in an office environment and had a habit of ignoring posted safety rules when she believed they were unnecessary. She navigated the busy corridors, pushing a metal grocery cart with her 6-year-old child seated comfortably inside, having filled it with their weekly shopping haul, weighing approximately 40 pounds. Approaching the downward escalator leading to the parking level, Zelda encountered prominent yellow warning signs prohibiting shopping carts and strollers on the moving stairs. The signs clearly directed customers with wheeled items to use the elevator located just 30 feet away, where other shoppers were already using the alternative route. A middle-aged woman nearby noticed Zelda positioning her loaded cart at the escalator entrance and warned her, pointing to the posted signs and gesturing toward the nearby elevator. Zelda waved off the concern and continued forward, appearing annoyed by the interruption and confident that the rules did not apply to her. As Zelda attempted to guide the cart onto the moving steps, the front wheels initially rolled onto the first step successfully. Within seconds, however, the rear wheels caught firmly against the metal comb plate at the escalator entrance. This mechanical resistance caused the heavy cart to twist violently sideways across the full width of the moving staircase. The sudden rotation threw her child forward from their seated position, sending them tumbling onto the escalator steps below. Zelda instinctively lunged forward to help, but the twisted cart now created an unstable barrier. She fell chest first across the metal frame, her upper body striking the cart's edge with considerable force. The escalator's downward motion kept pressing the twisted cart forward, driving Zelda's upper body against the side panel as the steps continued to move beneath her. Her head and chest were pinned briefly between the cart's metal frame and the escalator side panel, while her body was dragged several steps before the motion could be stopped. Witnesses later reported that her head struck the metal edge of the escalator housing during the struggle. Nearby shoppers stood frozen momentarily in shock before anyone reacted. After approximately 7 seconds, multiple witnesses rushed to activate the emergency stop button, bringing the escalator to an abrupt halt. By the time the escalator stopped, Zelda was slumped across the cart and not responding to those calling her name, showing only shallow, irregular breathing. Emergency medical responders arrived within minutes, working carefully to extract both victims from the escalator mechanism. Paramedics immediately assessed Zelda's condition, but could detect no signs of life. She was pronounced dead at the scene despite their efforts. Security personnel cordoned off the area while investigators documented the scene. The subsequent medical examination determined that Zelda had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head and upper chest, along with crushing injuries caused by being pinned against the escalator structure. The medical examiner concluded that the combination of head impact and chest compression led to rapid loss of consciousness and cardiac arrest. Her child survived the fall with only minor injuries, requiring basic medical treatment at a nearby hospital. Mall security provided surveillance footage that clearly documented the entire sequence of events from multiple angles. Local authorities confirmed that the escalator had been operating normally and that all emergency stop systems functioned as designed when activated by witnesses. The final investigation concluded that the fatality resulted directly from equipment misuse, despite clearly posted safety guidelines and the immediate availability of safe alternatives. It was January 14th, 2018. The warm afternoon sun hung over a rural crossing in Bihar, India, where a touring van sat trapped behind a chaotic crowd at an unmanned railroad junction. Paula Denton, a 56-year-old retired accountant from Manchester, had paid a premium for a 2-week cultural tour package that promised authentic experiences across northern India. Paula had worked 34 years for a regional financial firm before taking early retirement. Friends described her as efficient but chronically impatient, someone who prided herself on punctuality and control. She'd booked this tour through a discount travel agency specializing in budget cultural expeditions for retirees. The itinerary was aggressive, cramming 14 historical sites into 13 days with tight transportation windows. Paula had already complained multiple times about delays, posting frustrated reviews on the tour company's social media about missed connections and poor time management. Her group had fallen 2 hours behind schedule that morning due to an unplanned detour, making Paula visibly agitated throughout the drive. Unmanned railroad crossings are common throughout rural Bihar, where manual gates are operated inconsistently or abandoned entirely. The crossings rely on horn signals and painted warnings, with trains passing at speeds between 40 and 60 miles per hour through populated areas. Local pedestrians typically clear the tracks when they hear approaching locomotives, but the system depends entirely on individual awareness and judgment. That afternoon, dozens of villagers blocked the road near the crossing, participating in a spontaneous market that had spilled onto the street. The tour van sat immobilized in the gridlock. The crossing had minimal signage and no barriers. Paula became increasingly vocal about the delay. At 3:15 in the afternoon, she abruptly opened the van door and stepped out, ignoring the tour guide's repeated warnings to remain inside. Multiple passengers later reported she was complaining loudly about incompetence and wasted vacation days. She pushed aggressively through the crowd toward the crossing, her frustration visible to everyone nearby. The tour guide attempted to physically block her path, but she shoved past. The train's horn began blaring in the distance, signaling its approach to the unmanned crossing. Instead of clearing the tracks, Paula stepped directly onto the rails, waving her arms frantically. Witnesses reported she appeared confused, misjudged the train's speed, and seemed to expect it would stop before reaching the crossing. The horn continued blaring continuously as the engineer spotted her and immediately applied emergency braking. The steel wheels screamed against the rails, but physics made stopping impossible. At approximately 3:20 in the afternoon, the locomotive struck her full body at an estimated 45 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic and instant. Her body was thrown sideways before being pulled under the front of the locomotive. Severe traumatic amputation of limbs and catastrophic torso trauma occurred, incompatible with life. Screaming erupted immediately as the train finally ground to a halt several hundred yards past the crossing. Local police arrived within 20 minutes, responding to multiple emergency calls from villagers. The train engineer, traumatized and shaking, confirmed he had applied brakes the moment he saw her on the tracks. Paula's remains were scattered across about 55 yards of track, requiring careful recovery by railway authorities. The post-mortem examination was brief and definitive. The report noted severe limb amputation and torso trauma incompatible with life. The tour company quietly canceled the remaining itinerary without public statement. Authorities questioned the company regarding safety procedures and tour guide supervision. Paula's family received a partial refund and a non-disclosure settlement, with no official acknowledgement of the incident in company materials. It was August 11th, 2018, and cool morning air carried a strong hydrogen sulfide odor across a geothermal field outside Reykjavik, Iceland. Steam rose from vents scattered across the barren volcanic landscape. Wooden boardwalks connected viewing platforms above active hot springs with rope barriers and warning signs marking designated safe pathways. Mirelle Ashford was 56 years old and owned an art gallery in Charleston, specializing in contemporary sculpture. She had traveled to Iceland with her husband for a 10-day landscape tour. Her husband later described her as intellectually condescending and dismissive of guides, often mocking organized tourism. They joined a small guided tour of the geothermal area. The group of 9 tourists was accompanied by a licensed guide with over 8 years of experience. The tour company operated under permits requiring visitors to remain on designated boardwalks. Before entry, the guide conducted a safety briefing, explaining that visible hot springs were fed by superheated groundwater with temperatures near boiling. He emphasized that the surrounding ground was unstable, consisting of thin crust layers covering scalding water and mud just inches below the surface. Rope barriers marked surveyed safe zones, while areas beyond contained unassessed vents capable of causing severe burns within seconds. As the group moved along the boardwalk, Mirelle repeatedly interrupted, stating the tour felt overly cautious and that barriers limited access to more interesting features. They stopped at a viewing platform overlooking a vivid blue pool ringed with white mineral deposits. Steam rose steadily from its surface. The platform stood about 15 feet back, separated by rope barriers and warning signs. The guide explained the pool's color resulted from suspended silica particles and reiterated that the ground beyond the barrier was unstable. Mirelle complained that the experience did not match promotional materials and said she had paid for authenticity, not to stand behind ropes. The guide repeated that the restrictions were mandatory. While the guide answered questions from other tourists, Mirelle walked along the boardwalk toward a section where the rope barrier was secured to a wooden post about 30 feet away. Her husband called after her. She paused, looked back at the guide, and stepped over the rope onto bare ground. Her husband shouted immediately. The guide ran toward her, ordering her to step back. Mirelle ignored him and walked slowly toward white, crusted earth that appeared solid, holding up her phone and narrating that she was accessing restricted areas. After approximately 20 feet, the ground beneath her right foot collapsed. Her leg plunged into scalding mud before she fell forward, breaking through the fragile crust with her hands and left leg. The surface gave way further, dropping her into a shallow depression filled with superheated mud and water. Her cries were immediate. The guide stopped at the barrier edge, radioing emergency services as steam rose from vents between his position and Mirelle, making a direct rescue unsafe. She attempted to push herself up, but sank deeper as the surrounding crust continued to crumble. When her husband moved toward the barrier, the guide restrained him, explaining specialized equipment was required. Geothermal rescue personnel arrived within 19 minutes, using rigid boards to distribute weight. They extracted Mirelle, who remained conscious but in severe distress. Her clothing was badly damaged by heat and mineral-rich water, and extensive burns covered her legs, arms, hands, and portions of her torso. A medical helicopter transported her to a hospital in Reykjavik. Despite aggressive burn management, her condition deteriorated over the next 16 hours, progressing to multi-organ failure. She was pronounced dead the following morning. Post-mortem findings determined that death resulted from multi-organ system failure, secondary to severe thermal burns covering approximately 40% of her body surface area. Authorities concluded the tour company followed required safety protocols and that the guide's actions were appropriate. Video recovered from Mirelle's phone documented her barrier violation and the guide's warnings. Additional signage and higher barriers were later installed at the site.
It was July 16, 2016, in Napa Valley, California. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the vineyards. An outdoor wedding reception was being held at a vineyard estate with approximately 140 guests in attendance. Valerie Hutchins, 38, was a real estate agent from San Francisco who specialized in luxury properties. She was known for walking out of listings that didn't meet her standards and had been asked to leave several open houses after making loud criticisms about staging choices. Friends who knew her well had learned to avoid inviting her to casual gatherings, as she had a habit of pointing out what she considered tacky decor or subpar catering. She had flown in specifically for this wedding and had complained about the parking situation and the lack of valet service. She also made pointed observations about what she considered poor planning, from the mismatched chair covers to the amateur floral arrangements. She had been drinking wine steadily since the cocktail hour began at 6 p.m., growing louder with each glass. Valerie wore a cocktail dress and heeled sandals. Her hands were damp from condensation on her wine glass and the humid evening air. She had no technical knowledge of generators or electrical systems. Approximately 10 minutes after confronting the staff member, Valerie walked away from her table toward the generator location. Several guests noticed her heading in that direction but did not follow. She moved behind the lattice panels where the generator sat on a rubber mat. The generator was running at full capacity, with multiple heavy-duty extension cords connected to its outlets. The unit's metal frame was grounded, but investigators later noted damage to the protective casing near the connection panel had exposed a live electrical point. Valerie gripped the generator's metal frame with both hands, attempting to drag or push it away from the seating area. The unit weighed approximately 200 pounds and did not move. She adjusted her grip, placing her right hand on the frame and her left hand near the electrical panel where the cords were connected. Her left hand made contact with an exposed terminal where the protective casing had cracked. The generator was actively supplying electrical power through its outlets. Investigators later determined she made contact with an exposed live connection, allowing current to pass through her body while her other hand remained on the metal frame. The electrical current caused immediate involuntary muscle contractions. Valerie's hands clenched tighter around the contact points, preventing her from releasing her grip. Her body went rigid, and she remained in contact with the generator for several seconds before collapsing backward onto the ground. A guest walking toward the restroom area saw Valerie fall and called out for help. Valerie was lying on her back, unresponsive and not breathing. Her hands showed visible burn marks. Guests immediately called emergency services while others began CPR, and the generator was shut off within about 90 seconds. Responders arrived 9 minutes later and continued resuscitation efforts, but Valerie never regained consciousness or a pulse. She was transported to a medical facility and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was cardiac arrest from electrical shock, with burn marks on both hands confirming sustained contact with a live electrical source. Investigators later determined a recently damaged casing had exposed energized components while the generator was running. The death was ruled accidental, and civil liability claims against the venue were eventually settled privately.
Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.